We got that sorted out. Hello, everyone. I'm not presenting, by the way. My name is Jola Ajibade. I'll be chairing this session, which is focused on international adaptation in place. And we're going to have 3 speakers today. I apologize that we're a little bit behind time, but we do have just 3 speakers, so we should be fine. And I just want to say a few things before I introduce our first speaker. The first thing is that adaptation in place is a very powerful concept that challenges the assumption that climate change or climate resilience require the relocation of people. Around the world, communities facing sea level rise, drought, flood, wildfires, and compounding hazard are choosing to stay, not because they lack options, but because place identity and sovereignty matters. Internationally, adaptation in place involves navigating uneven resources, historical injustices, and differing cultural relationship to land, all while finding innovative ways to thrive amidst crisis. Our 3 speakers this evening, and thank you all for being here. It's already 5:15, so thank you. So our 3 speakers this evening will explore what it looks like on the ground to adapt in place, and they will be touching on this across borders and in various contexts. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present their work, and we'll have about 30 minutes of conversation at the end of the 3 presentations. And I'll start by introducing our first speaker, Domenico Bubienzo. He's a PhD student from Cal Post University. He brings us into the context of Ethiopia, a country facing intersecting pressures of climate variability and socioeconomic transformations. So his talk today is titled Assessing the Impact of Climate and Socioeconomic Changes, a case study of Ethiopia. Without much ado, please join me in welcoming Domenico.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. As was just mentioned, I'm Domenico, and I'm a PhD student from Campus University. So today I will be presenting a preliminary analysis about the case study of Ethiopia, and my analysis is aimed actually to extending an existing composite-based indicator used in a humanitarian context. So without spending more time on this, I would like to probably spend a little bit of more words on what are actually the scope of this work. So firstly, the scope of this work aims to include climate change, amplified hazard, and socioeconomic changes at subnational level for the case study of Ethiopia in order to quantify future risk for the year of 2050, integrate food insecurity and human mobility projections, and in this way also allows to monitor progress and needs in terms of adaptation, risk reduction, and humanitarian assistance. Why Ethiopia, and a little bit of context of the country into analysis. So, as you might see, you might know, Ethiopia is a very vulnerable country. It is actually located on the Horn of Africa. It is a landlocked country, and it is one among the most food insecure and mobile countries in the world. What makes Ethiopia very vulnerable to climate change is actually culture, with more than 70% of the population living in rural areas. And apart from it, the impacts of climate change are also exacerbated by compounding risks like conflict, also increasing inequality in the country. That in a certain sense make Ethiopia a very hotspot country to take into consideration in terms of humanitarian crisis and risk for the future. And also, thanks to the new availability of data, these kind of countries might be also have much more interest and availability to be investigated in the future because of new data coming out. Okay, so as I was mentioning at the beginning, so the scope of my work is to extend an existing composite-based indicator used in humanitarian context. This composite-based indicator is part of INFORM initiative. The INFORM initiative is a multi-stakeholder forum for developing shared quantitative analysis relevant to crises and disasters. It is composed by 4 main products covering different stages of disaster management cycle. So starting from the INFORM risk. INFORM risk is the the first tool, and allows to assess where and what type of risks are emerging in some specific hotspot. There is also a second tool that is based and used in humanitarian context, that is the informed warning. Informed warning is actually a composite-based indicator that allows to quantify and to, in a certain sense, function early warning systems to visualize some hotspot areas that might be interested by future crises. Informed severity, that is another composite-based indicator that allows to assess the severity of a crisis. And the informed climate change that allows to integrate and to quantify the risk in the future due to climate and socioeconomic changes. Why it is important also to mention this? Because this informed initiative is actually was developed by different stakeholders, among which JRC, UN OCHA, so IDMC, different international stakeholders, and it is used also to quantify and to allocate humanitarian funds. So it's actually a tool that is very well known and used in humanitarian context. So I will now talk a little bit of the informed climate change. That is actually the tool I use to advance and to develop my analysis. So as I was mentioning, through this preliminary analysis, my purpose was to adapt the informed climate change index framework in order to fit to what were like actually the key local stakeholder needs and in certain sense information on Ethiopia. And in this way, we were able actually to predict what might be the impact, the future impact for Ethiopia, by also taking into consideration what were actually the policymakers and stakeholders in the context information that might be relevant to run this analysis. So not only use actually this tool as a potential tool for literature purposes, but also as a potential tool that might be also used by future stakeholders. And before going too deep into the analysis, I would like to also mention that the informed climate change risk index is based on a multi-layer composite indicator that account for hazard and exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. Each of these composed by two main dimensions. In the case of hazard and exposure, it is natural and human dimensions, vulnerability, socioeconomic conditions, and vulnerable groups. And also it takes into consideration information about lack of coping capacity, such as institutional capacity, but also infrastructural capacity. In total, it takes into consideration more than 40 indicators. So to project and to quantify the future risk, I'm taking into consideration two main scenarios. The SSPV1, that is envisages a more sustainable future scenario, where there is actually contained population growth and sustainable development and economy, and SSP3, it is actually envisages a more extreme scenario, or better, what is actually the current scenario. So these two scenarios are taken into consideration in my analysis, also due to the availability of food insecurity and migration projection data. Now let's start to what is the methodology and data at the basis of the composite-based indicator. So for informed climate change, risk is actually a result of a multiplicative equation factors, where each of these components are equally weighted. And as I was mentioning, the purpose of my work was actually to integrate food insecurity mobility projections at some national level. And to do this, I was also aimed to currently develop what were hazard and exposure dimensions at some national level. So at this point for Ethiopia, I was considering JRC river flood hazard maps at different return periods, and all these were aggregated at annual level. And the same was done for drought layers. We were able actually to take into consideration an ensemble mean of different models from the SMI-P6 models, so from very recent climate models. And ultimately, we also include conflict projections related to internal armed conflicts. And in this way, we took into consideration country-level resolution data because they were not available at more fine resolution. And now going into the first part of the results, as you might see, actually, This slide is showing you the hazard and exposure dimensions for different regions in Ethiopia. And as you can see, actually the east part of the country is prone to be more vulnerable to what are the hazards components and the exposure components related to climate. And what is actually important to notice in this slide is actually by looking at the two different SSP scenarios. So the first is the SSP1 and the second is the SSP3, the more extreme scenarios. There is actually a significant change in the ranks of hazard exposure for this composite-based indicator. And some of these regions that are actually interested by these changes are actually also those regions that were and that are still most exposed to floods and drought. So, as you can see from the table at the bottom, there are actually, I pointed out there, the main regions that are interested by these changes, and among these, Beshangul Gumat, that is actually on the west, it seems also be interested by these different score ranges when taking into consideration these different scenarios. Now, just going back to what was actually the previous equation of risk for the vulnerability component, we were able to take into consideration population projections for the two same scenarios, SSP1 and SSP3. These data were derived from the CDAC. And for also vulnerability, we took into consideration internal migration projection data for two scenarios, SSP1 and SSP3. And this one was actually derived from the African Climate Mobility Initiative. And thirdly, we derived food insecurity projections based on survey data, by taking into consideration a panel of 3 waves from 2011 to 2015, and derived from these actually what were actually the coefficients explaining food insecurity from survey data, and then we use these coefficients to predict food insecurity projections at annual level. And ultimately, we also include human development projections that might be actually also a potential indicator of what might be vulnerability, but also the potential capacity of a country to adapt and to be actually developed in the future. And for what you can notice from actually this layer of risk, again, there are some regions, especially on the east side of the country, as Afar and Somali, that are actually much more vulnerable compared to the rest of the country. And this is explained by the fact that these regions are actually very agricultural regions, so very exposed to what were actually and what are the climate extremes. But then, as you can see, when actually implying and taking into consideration both the scenarios, SSP1, SSP3, also the regions on the east side experience significantly change in terms of vulnerability. And this is due also to the socioeconomic development conditions of these regions that are actually very influenced by these two different scenarios. But what is important to stress here is actually that in both cases, the same regions appear to be actually vulnerable in the future. Now, going towards the conclusion, so what might emerge from the last slide is actually the main outcome and the consideration of all these components of risk. Quantified by this analysis and by these plots that you can see here. And as you can see, still again from our baseline 2015, the most vulnerable but also the most risk regions appear to be those one on the east. But apparently, when taking into consideration all the components of risk, there are actually some regions that you can see on the left that appear to actually increase and improve in terms of risk when taking into consideration all these different indicators. And the same regions, when using the SSP3 scenarios, appear actually to have a more higher risk ranks. And this might also be the case for the middle regions that are actually here and here. But as you can see, there are also some regions that remain almost stable in both scenarios. Going to the conclusion, so what can be actually extrapolated from this analysis is that actually future extreme events can severely and differently impact specific regions in Ethiopia. And as you can see from, as you have seen from the analysis, actually both the hazards and the hazard exposure and the vulnerability components are actually some indications of what might be put in place to mitigate risk, and so in this sense can inform different kind of stakeholders. And also what was not mentioned before, it was actually that for the vulnerability project especially, what was driving vulnerability were actually projected from insecure and people who moved in those specific regions. In this case, so we are able actually to provide an additive tool to inform what might be actually this disaster risk reduction and recovery and development programs that might actually occur in the future. With this, I've concluded, and thank you very much for the attention. And available for questions.
Thank you again, Domenico, for that very interesting and innovative work. I will now invite our second speaker, who will try to make sure you're working. So I just, in case for those of you who may not know Jan, I met Jan a couple of years ago at a Birkmann conference, and his work is really truly innovative. So Jan is a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich, and today you'll be presenting on migration as adaptation or maladaptation in the context of environmental change, evidence from Bangladesh. And for many people who live in Bangladesh, we do know that it's a very contexted case when it comes to migration issues. So Jan's work brings critical insight into how mobility, often seen as a solution, can also deepen vulnerability when not supported by just an inclusive framework. So he's going to be showing us multiple perspectives on that. So yes, and then you just press on that. So welcome Jan again, everyone.
Thank you so much for the
Yeah, we can just start.
introduction.
Let me just
For the speech. One of ours. Sharing here. Sharing.
It's still sharing, never stopped. So you just click on, yeah.
Sharing that one now? Okay. Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for staying with us so late. Yeah, I'm presenting now research that moves from the provincial level to the individual household level on a big survey project in Bangladesh, titled Migration as Adaptation or Maladaptation in the Context of Environmental Changes, Evidence from Bangladesh. So where this talk starts is that I would say historically in the literature, migration has for a fair time been seen as failed adaptation, so the assumption being that the preferred choice would be to adapt in situ. If that doesn't work, then people move. But I think in recent years, more and more literature has emerged that shows that migration might be an adaptation strategy in and of itself. But as I'll show in a minute, it's not self-evident that it will really be a successful strategy. And while this is a general question, the migration literature, of course, as you all know, being here at that conference, that question got even more pressing given the increasing frequency and severity of environmental changes that we are facing. So just very brief look into the literature, and the main focus will be on the empirics, but to motivate why we're actually studying this is that migration has been shown to be a successful adaptation strategy. For example, it can distribute and minimize household risk by, for example, providing access to different income sources. It can increase to resilience at both home and destination countries. So migrants, for example, bring social capital to host communities, and they might bring back innovation that they learn in their destination community to the home community. So there's various exchanges of knowledge, for example. And then, of course, a very classical form of migration adaptation is remittances. So, for example, Bangladesh, which I'll talk about in a minute, has a huge expat community in, for example, the Arab countries that sends a significant sum of money each year back to Bangladesh. But then on the other hand, migration can also be maladaptive. So first of all, for individuals, it can increase vulnerability. If you come to a city where you're then maybe an outsider, or you end up living in informal settlements that are endangering your health. Of course, there might be cultural and social challenges of integrating. That's of course even more relevant in contexts that have, for example, different ethnicities, or if you move to a different country even. And lastly, it can of course also have negative impacts on host communities if, let's say, competition for jobs and other resources increases. So this is not a comprehensive list, but just to give a bit impression on different aspects. And then it gets even more complex because on the one hand, there's different temporal and spatial scales. So what might be a short-term positive adaptation strategies for households might in the mid or long term be negative for host communities or destination regions. And secondly, it's also very much influenced by governance and policy, so it's highly context specific which of these mechanisms is predominant. So as you see, it's from the outset, it's not clear whether migration is positive or negative. So in the end, why I'm showing this slide is to basically motivate that it's an empirical question where we just need to collect data and see what really happens when people migrate. So that's the focus of this paper. Can migration after environmental shocks be considered an adaptive or maladaptive strategy? I will speak specifically about the context of Bangladesh, where I've done my PhD research for the past 4 years. It's one of the most climate vulnerable countries on Earth. Probably most of you have heard that they're affected by different environmental impacts just due to their geographical region in one of the largest deltas, then in the Bay of Bengal, where there's a frequent cyclone risk, etc. But then there's also a hotspot for migration. So the groundswell reports have already been mentioned this morning in the opening plenary, modeling migration related to climate change and finding that Bangladesh also is one of the hotspots here, with a potential of 3.6 to 13.3 million internal migrants by 2050. So in particular, in our project, we focus on a region, the Jamuna, that's particularly prone to riverbank erosion and flooding. I'm showing one picture because I myself wasn't aware of the scale of erosion in that river system. It's not the erosion that we see on the rivers, at least where I grew up. It was very small scale erosion. Here it's really entire chunks of soil that break into the river during the monsoon season, taking with them entire villages and plots of agricultural land, etc. So very drastic impacts. Now what we've done is that we basically tracked around 1,700 households from 36 villages along that river system. So that's the entire 250 kilometers from the border with India to where it merges with the Ganges. 36 villages shown in red here. And then per village, we had around 75 households that were geographically stratified to get a representative sample. And these 1,700 households we followed for 3 years, interviewing them roughly every 2 months and trying to understand when are they affected by environmental changes and when do people move, where do they go, etc. So it was a large-scale survey project. The idea being that we have a quasi-experimental setting where, due to the large number of villages and households, just naturally over time certain households and villages would be affected by erosion and flooding, others would not, and that allows us to form, like in a medical study, a treatment and control group, where in our case treatment is being affected by erosion or flooding, and the control group would be the unaffected households. So then in the end, the idea being that we can draw statistically causal inferences on the effect of environmental changes on migration. So that was the main focus of my PhD research. Now for that paper, we do it basically the next step. Now I want to investigate the effect of migration on certain outcome variables. So the way the data structure looks like, it's highlighted here, this temporal timeline, where first we did a baseline survey in 2021 before the monsoon. Monsoon happens, erosion and flooding happens, then we came back, we re-interviewed the same households, also followed them if they migrated. So we have an attrition rate of less than 7% overall. And then we repeat that exercise for 2 more monsoon seasons. So in total, we cover 3 monsoon seasons. And in each post-monsoon season, we basically assess, have households migrated or not. And then in the case of this paper now, what I'm looking at as dependent outcome variables are, first of all, the household socioeconomic status. So this is measured as a composite index, looking at households' assets and income, for example, and then self-assessed subjective life satisfaction. And lastly, in this case, as a moderator, we also measure self-assessed whether people have been affected by erosion and flooding in the previous monsoon season, also staged by different degrees of severity of that impact. So whether they lost their house or whether they just lost or had damage to the house, for example, that's different levels of severity. So now one word on that notion of mobility, which also in the literature, funnily, it's not clearly defined. When does migration, like what is migration? We therefore came up with our own definition where we define migration as soon as a household leaves the administrative boundary of the village, it's migration. The reason being that we observed a lot of very short distance migration in that region, that people really shift just a few hundred meters as a risk management strategy to get away from the river. And that of course makes it then difficult to determine, I mean, if somebody moves to the capital Dhaka, I think it's clearer, but if it's just a few hundred meters, it's not so easy. That's why this is our definition. And then I'll get back to that in a minute. We also have to differentiate forms of mobility. So first of all, we observed households that basically took their whole household and left the village, basically relocating with the whole household, with the whole house to a location outside the village. But then secondly, we also have a lot of temporary migration where the household stays in the village and then household head or son or daughter, somebody moves outside the village for a certain time and then comes back. So that's the classical case, for example, of labor migration, but you also have educational moves, for example. So the core difference being whether the whole household center shifts or not. Why this is important? So this is now jumping into the results in a difference setup. So what that means is we have on the left the values for socioeconomic status. So this is now basically the higher it means the wealthier a household is, the lower the poorer, measured once for the pre-monsoon, so before the erosion happens, and once after the monsoon, and differentiating the groups with the circles, it's those who migrated, with the triangles, it's those who didn't migrate, and then we can compare here whether any of the two groups has significant movements. And as it seems on that graph, you see all the confidence intervals are overlapping, so there's no impact of migration as it seems here. However, if we now split the migrants by type of migration, we see a very different picture. So the scale here shifts, that's why the left side is identical to this one, just now it's going up to 1. And what we see is that, again, the circles are the non-migrants, so they stay identical, but then those who leave the village with the entire household, they drastically increase their socioeconomic status. Those who do labor migration, they slightly decrease it. So here, I think the important takeaway is that we really need to look at the specific form of migration. So this was now shown just for one wave. This is what I just had on the right, but we can, in our case, of course, since we have the data set, also track that over time. So now what happens on the right is that I just add the 2 other monsoon seasons with the same logic. So we see first the jump of socioeconomic status for the permanent migrants, and then over time it decreases again. The non-migrants more or less constant, and the temporary migrants, they have the drop and then also stay more or less constant. So at least as it seems here, it's of course not a very long time series. It seems to level out and really be more a short-term booster. Now we can repeat that exercise also as a robustness check for the different years that we have in the sample. So now I basically just vary when do people migrate, just looking at those that migrate newly, now not between wave 1 and 2, but between 2 and 3 or 3 and 4. But in both, all three cases, we get the same effect that we see that strong increase for the permanent migrants. So this does not seem to be just the effect of that particular year, but really be a consistent pattern. Now, secondly, as I mentioned, we don't only look now at economic outcomes that we observe, but we also look at subjective well-being. So now the right graph basically changes the outcome variable from socioeconomic status to a self-assessed overall life satisfaction scale from 1 to 5. So higher values mean that people are very satisfied with their life. What we see here is that we also see an increase for permanent migrants, but that comes a year later. So there's apparently a lag where socioeconomic status jumps up immediately, but then it takes a while to translate into also subjective well-being. And then lastly, last result slide, and that's now I think the core maybe for that conference also is how does that now relate to environmental shocks? So I can differentiate and split the sample between those who have been affected by environmental changes in between wave 1 and wave 2 and those who have not been affected. And we see here for those who have not been affected, it's not really a very clear picture. But then if people have been affected by migration, erosion or flooding, then this move out of the village really drastically increases their socioeconomic status. So this also suggests that, especially in the context of environmental affectedness, migration can help households to escape the impact situation. However, all of that is quite preliminary, so I'm also looking forward to your feedback if you have any suggestions on the analysis. But for now, the preliminary conclusion would be that migration, if it happens with that whole household, it seems to lead to an increase in short-term, a short-term increase in socioeconomic status, which then diminishes over time. This individual migration, it has the opposite effect. It rather leads to a slight decrease. Life satisfaction follows with some temporal lag. And this is, as I mentioned, particularly pronounced for respondents impacted by environmental shocks. So for policy, I think it's important that on the one hand, yes, migration can be a viable adaptation strategy, but it seems to be very much dependent on the type of migration and the temporal dimension we look at. So still there's, of course, a huge scope for policy to support that. Next steps, as I'm in the middle of the data analysis here. So on the one hand, we also have data whether people went to rural contexts or to cities. So that's something I want to look at the destination and how that impacts these outcomes. And secondly, since we have 4 years, people in these 4 years also migrated multiple times. So that's also something that I want to look at. Right now, I just had one migration event. But what happens with compound migration, or sometimes the whole household shifts and then one member moves on top. So basically all these combinations, how they can play together. Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you. We'll move on to our last speaker very quickly. Name is, Rebecca. Rebecca, if you come up, Rebecca Holloway. And she's going to be talking about the impact of flooding and cyclone on polar communities in Bangladesh Delta, local desires for adaptation over migration. And I believe this paper possibly explores why, despite ongoing hazard met, some residents may prefer to stay and what their choices might be, and what it might reveal about place identity and agency. So please, let's welcome Rebecca Holloway if you come up. And if you have to make sure that we are constantly sharing. We may just have about 5 minutes for conversation after this, just because of technical issues. I think we're a little bit beyond time, but we should still have time for a few questions. Yes, as a group, that's the idea.
Just presentation.
Yes. And you just click and share, yeah, okay, that's it.
You started?
That's the one below, yeah.
All right, good evening, everyone, and again, thank you for sticking around for this late presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you to Joern for those incredible insights. It was very exciting, given similar region, to hear that work. So my name is Rebecca Holloway, and I will be presenting a research paper of mine with Michael Steckler at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and my co-authors here. It is a social science project investigating the impact of flooding and cyclone storm events on polder communities in the Bangladesh River Delta. And I thank Dibara Diori for the use of this image on the upper left, which is her mural in Khulna, Bangladesh. So our study area was in two embanked polder communities in southwest Bangladesh, both located near the Sundarbans mangrove forest and the Bay of Bengal. On the left, to orient you with the Bay of Bengal to the south, Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, is the green dot, and the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna, or GBM river, through the center. This river system is formed by the confluence of these three major rivers in Bangladesh. And on the top right of the figure is the first locality of our study areas, Srinagar, polder 32. Which is an embanked island adjacent to the Sundarbans forest that became well known for its severe flooding in 2009. And the second site is to the west, and that's Kumarkali on an embanked polder 35-1. This is located in Maralganj, east of the Sundarbans and along the Thaleshwar River. And these sites were selected because they are located within the delineated coastal zone, and they contain populations that are particularly vulnerable to water salinity fluctuations, cyclones, floods, and storm surges, as well as because the locations were also historically the sites of other long-term research projects with this paper's authors and affiliates, allowing the establishment of local relations and a high level of trust within the localities. So we used in-depth, semi-structured interviews to ask local residents, how do they perceive recent changes in the seasons and environment? How do residents cope with changes? What external assistance do they require? And lastly, do they perceive migration as a strategy to adapt to these changes? So in this presentation, I'll provide a regional context, our method, a summary of our findings and key insights, followed by a few remarks on takeaways and further applications. So as quick background, over 170 million people live in the GBM Delta spanning Bangladesh and West Bengal, India. Despite its population density, the region faces both rapid and slow onset climate shocks that threaten livelihoods. Between 2000 and 2019, Bangladesh endured at least 185 extreme weather events, with an average of over 570 deaths per year, tragically ranking as the 7th most affected country by climatic hazards by the Global Climate Risk Index, excuse me. The region faces several major environmental risks, namely catastrophic floods from cyclones, storm surges, as well as the annual seasonal monsoon rain that can bring up to 2 meters of rainfall, increasing river flow more than tenfold. So these threats are intensified by land subsidence and tidal amplification, and to manage flood risk and support agriculture, over 100 polders, which is a Dutch word, and they're embanked human-made islands, were built in the 60s and 70s through bilateral cooperation with the Netherlands and foreign assistance. And we also have extreme heat as a major issue, not to leave that out, for well-being and livelihoods. And just last year, communities had to withstand prolonged periods of extreme temperatures, 110 Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius. So agriculture is the largest employment sector in Bangladesh, and over 70% of the land is devoted to it. And major crops in the Delta region are rice, jute, and tea. And during the dry season, also thousands of brick kilns become active, and these produce around 30 billion bricks a year to meet construction demand. And these kilns provide seasonal work, but they also come with health and environmental costs. And many Delta residents also depend on subsistence fishing as well. So in our project, we examined these 3 distinct mobility outcomes in response to environmental stress. So partial migration, which occurs when households send 1 or more members to nearby cities to earn income. And these remittances help the household adapt by offsetting agricultural income shocks and enhancing adaptive capacity at home. And the second is trapped non-migration. And this captures those who express a desire to move but are constrained by structural barriers, resulting in heightened vulnerability. And the last is voluntary non-migration, which reflects an active adaptation strategy where a household chooses to stay, not out of constraint, but to preserve non-economic ecosystem services that sustain a strong sense of place despite economic instability. So this framework highlights the importance of approaching immobility as a complex place-based process shaped by intersecting social, economic, and environmental factors, and it isn't merely a binary choice to move or stay. So it's very complex. So in this project, our fieldwork was in March 2023, and we used semi-structured in-depth interviews to gain insights from residents. We used purposive sampling. We selected participants with deep local knowledge or those identified by the community as especially insightful. And all interviewees were eager to share with us and they also noted that their views reflected broader community perspectives. So interviews covered 3 key areas: perception of recent seasonal and climate changes, and we defined those as within the past 10 years. Adaptation, flooding and assistance, and migration experiences and outlooks. And questions were then refined with our translators, who also facilitated open-ended discussion through live English-Bengali translation. So we worked closely with students at the Dhaka University there. All of the interviews were recorded and they were transcribed by native speakers, both in Dhaka and here at Columbia, and then coded using AI models. This work was in collaboration with Mandela University. So what did we find? This is a demographic breakdown. So in total, we interviewed 22 community members, 11 men and 11 women, with ages ranging from early 20s to early 70s. And that average respondent was 46 years old, with a household size of 4 to 5 members and an average education level of 6th grade. Respondents played a variety of roles within their community. Most women respondents were housewives, while most men worked as farmers or day laborers. So here on the left, the vectors are showing migration from the Delta region, often to cities and economic hubs. And it's a snapshot of our results that are showing that a majority of residents that did migrate had done so for economic opportunity, jobs, and education as well. However, we found that the majority of respondents told us that they would rather not move and instead adapt in place. And reasonings highlighted here show a connection to place, family, and overall not viewing moving as the best solution. And many participants also partially migrated. This is often seasonally, but not permanently leaving, as Joern mentioned. So the community, we learned through the project, had already begun taking several adaptation measures in response to environmental changes at home, such as shifting crops, planting shade trees, and raising their homes. To cope with increasingly severe heat. One example was a move toward watermelon farming, which is a less water-intensive crop. Women respondents also shared that they had adapted by shifting their labor, reporting choosing basket weaving in the shade over field work during the hottest parts of the day. And I'll add, although it's not highlighted in this slide, that in Srinagar, a high level of mutual aid and a strong community sentiment, both within and across villages, has been necessary in filling these gaps and helping fellow residents cope with severe storms. Furthermore, respondents indicated that aid desired fell into these 7 categories. The highest was food and cash handouts. The next was shelter, which included housing infrastructure and storm shelters, followed by clothing, blankets, and medication. And on the left is the cyclone shelter in Srinagar that was built in 2011, which was 3 years after the devastating cyclone Isla. Across both localities, residents expressed feeling unsupported by government aid, which is a key challenge that we identified. Many noted that access to assistance often depended on religious, socioeconomic, or political affiliation. And overall, there was a strong dissatisfaction with official aid efforts, with 19 out of 22 respondents who addressed the topic saying they had received no government support. This image is in a neighborhood where the road divides Hindu and Muslim communities, with the sides receiving different amounts of aid and services as reported to us. So residents are clearly experiencing more severe climate extremes, especially cyclones and flooding, and embankments that offered protection are no longer reliable, with impacts felt more intensely each year. But despite this, people are actively adapting. They've raised homes, shifted crops, and planted trees, but these efforts are limited by high poverty and a lack of consistent support, meaning residents have a low capacity to recover from repeated shocks. What we heard clearly is that most people don't want to leave, but require more assistance and long-term investment in resilience. And migration, while it happens, is not a simple or universal solution. And many people do move to cities like Khulna, Bagarhat, or Dhaka that we heard, mostly in search of work. But many people choose to stay. And for them, home is land, family, and history. And voluntary non-migration is a true form of adaptation rooted in social networks and a deep sense of place. Others still want to move but can't, all reflecting the aspiration capacity model. So ultimately, the finding support that migration is not inevitable, but shaped by complex local dynamics. And what communities are really asking for is to support adaptation in place, to protect their livelihoods, stay with their families, and continue building their futures where they are. So a quick conclusion, in the more broad sense, here we are at Columbia at this conference among experts on global climate mobility and resilience, but I want to leave us with the challenge to lecture less and listen more. As researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and leaders in this space, we have an immense responsibility, I believe, not only to generate knowledge, but to ensure that that knowledge can be translated into equitable place-based solutions, and that must begin with the voices of those communities, both local and indigenous, who have direct and often generational lived experience adapting and responding to the environment and to disasters and displacement, as is the case in the GBM region, particularly in places where community vulnerability is high and resources extremely limited. And this work, like many others presented this week, and I'm sure throughout the next couple of days, underscores the urgent need for climate science to be both interdisciplinary and actionable, and highlights the critical role of local knowledge and lived experience in shaping bottom-up lasting solutions. So addressing climate mobility demands that we be imaginative with our science as it exists, and that we build more community partnerships rooted in humility, understanding, and long-term commitment. Thank you so much.
I want to take this time to quickly thank all our three presenters for their innovative and quite thought-provoking presentations. So if you come up here, Domenico and Rebecca, and we only have about 9 minutes left, so I'll just go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. So, oh yeah, lots of questions. If you guys will take a seat, thank you. So, first question, yes.
For the authors working in Bangladesh, I'm quite curious about the mechanism. Well, maybe starting with Jan about what leads to the... I guess it's kind of counterintuitive that the increase in socioeconomic status is increasing suddenly and then decreasing over time. I would have imagined the cost of moving would actually have an impact that would be detectable on that, like just post-migration phase. Do you have any insights on that? And maybe since you've also been working in Bangladesh, you can add.
No, I don't.
You don't.
But it's on my list. I mean, as mentioned, I'm in the middle of that research, and it's also one question that I have. I mean, this socioeconomic status is a principal component analysis, and I want to look into what factors drive that, and then to understand if that's really happening or if it's an artifact of the data. So also putting that as a disclaimer that might still change. Yeah, important question.
And then we had much more limited data size, so there's only so much I can say, but from speaking to people, we did hear that we have evidence that moving is a prohibitive cost. So people who might want to leave have told us that they cannot do so. So, I mean, there is definitely the possibility that that is an impact.
Other questions? Okay, I will just ask one more question and I'll go to you, just to build off of what the first person said. So Jan, this question is for you. Your first set of work started in 2021, was that it? Did anything like COVID had an impact in terms of the boost? So if there, there was COVID in 2020, and then people moving in 2021 because of a cyclone or because of monsoon in this case. So did you ask question about some other regional or political economy issue like COVID? Did it impact people as well? And did that have an effect in terms of the shift in income levels? Did you ask this question?
Yeah, so that was one big fear that we had since COVID fell into that experimental period, that it would blast that whole study. So we included then a block on COVID and found that it was rarely an issue in these remote communities. These are very remote villages that are a few hours from the capital. So they didn't really care about it, and in the end, this erosion is just stronger than anything else. So if they lose their house, of course, they have to move. So, but we have it in the questionnaire. Luckily for us, it was not really a huge influence factor.
Thank you. It's good to know. So our next question, yes to you, and then I'll come to you. Yes, go ahead. Hi.
Thanks. I'm Colleen from Vienna. I loved all of your presentation. For me, it's really fun because I had a case study in Ethiopia, but like very similar to what you did in Bangladesh. And so my question is more like a comment on, I think it's really important to reflect on like the definitions that we use. And I found that for me, for my research, using mobilities was much more like, it made so much sense. And I liked how you define the temporal versus permanent moves. But I think it also makes sense to go beyond the beyond migration and like really incorporate like very small scale and very small temporal scale movements, like not like spatial and temporal. Because what I found in Ethiopia was that women, often housewives, also considered themselves as farmers, would go and like beg in other cities because they didn't have any work. It like the environmental degradation came to a point that they couldn't adapt in place, even though they wanted to. And this is what they were able to do like 5 years ago. But like after series of droughts over time, it wasn't possible anymore. So they had to find other solutions. And so it's like this work really made me like reflect on how you define everything. And this is one thing that you already started to do, but I think you kind of somehow need to go even further. But I really, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. So if you want to reflect, please do so, but it was really more a comment.
Absolutely. And I also liked your point of there is of like capacity to withstand and respond. And so although maybe people do have the capacity to do so for a certain period, whether that is long-term sustained, whether they're able to do that for long-term is still a question. And so that's a great point. Thank you.
We have one more question, I believe. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. Super interesting. I'm wondering, and Jan, I was thinking about, as you looked into the permanent versus the temporary kind of migration pieces and correlating that and saying, and this is maladaptation. I mean, did that happen in the absence? I mean, did your research happen in the absence of, their movements being in, part of a policy perspective? Are there policies or other programming that could have been put in place to change that temporary movement into actually a more positive impact? I mean, are you looking at it that they moved just without any kind of policies in place, or are there interventions that you can extrapolate out that would have actually turned it from a net negative or a nothing into a net positive as an adaptive response?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we also captured it in the survey whether they receive any government or NGO support. There are programs, but they're mainly support to stay. So at least we didn't find any programs that support people to move or enable these moves to be more adaptive. So in our case, the moves we observe happen in a policy vacuum, I would say, that people really just do it with their own social networks, but not with any government or NGO support. But like I said, how I understood the question correctly.
Exactly, yeah. I think you said it clearer than I did.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
2 more minutes, and you have a question, is it for Domenico?
No, it's actually for Jan, so if anybody has further.
I do have a question for Domenico, and the question is, in the framework that you showed us, so we could see risks, we could see vulnerability, we could see lack of capacity, but I didn't see anything in that framework that talks about people's capacity or their own resources. Are you planning to account for that? Because even in the context of risks and climate change, these things do not happen without some resources that local people themselves have. Are you thinking about incorporating that, or?
No, thank you for the question. And yeah, in my case, lack of coping capacity remain like fixed, but this also, it's related to the availability of data about coping capacity for the future, especially for the case of Ethiopia. And actually, I'm investigating the GDP projections at subnational level that might be a proxy of adaptive capacity, but right now I'm not considering. So there might be like space, but I don't see so many proxies that might cover the coping capacity.
Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to build on that question. I was interested, Domenico, on I don't know if this would be possible at all, but whether you were able to compare your risk index with people's perceptions of risks in those different places. Yeah, just that really.
I didn't, but because in a certain sense, I was following what was already a framework developed from Ethiopia based on what were, like, as I was mentioning, key local stakeholders' needs. So I didn't have this opportunity. Maybe it might be a good thing to do for the next step of my analysis for sure. And maybe this might be obtained from survey data, might be something that might be obtained from survey data. So thank you for the feedback, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We're now at exactly 6:30, so I want us to thank all of our presenters for today. The audience online as well as you. I hope we can continue this conversation informally even as we round this up, but I hope you also enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you again.